The loudest thing you ever did was believe yourself before the world had permission. Now listen to me closely. Welcome, chosen ones. Not the popular ones, not the approved ones, not the ones everyone clapped for early. I'm talking to the ones who spoke something dangerous out loud before it was safe, before it made sense, before there was proof. The ones they called crazy, the ones they side-eyed, the ones they laughed at and quietly prayed would be wrong. Bro, you spoke too soon, and now it's all coming true. And that's exactly why they're uncomfortable. Let's be very clear from the start. When you spoke early, you didn't expose yourself. You exposed the timeline. You exposed the fact that you were ahead of schedule in a world that only respects things after they're validated. You weren't loud. You were prophetic. You weren't reckless. You were aligned. And the reason it hit them the way it did is because chosen people don't ask permission before they move. They announce it, and reality has no choice but to catch up. Here's what they don't want to admit. Your words didn't bother them because they were wrong. Your words bothered them because they were early, and early truth always sounds like arrogance to people who are late to their own potential. You weren't talking nonsense. You were talking from the future. And that future has a way of making insecure people nervous because it reminds them of everything they didn't have the courage to say when it was their turn. You ever notice how the same mouth that laughed at you goes quiet when things start lining up? That's not coincidence. That's the sound of reality correcting the record. Because there's a moment, an uncomfortable, holy moment, when your words outrun your circumstances and the gap between the two exposes who can see and who can't. You spoke while the paint was still wet. They only respect finished portraits. But chosen ones see the blueprint before the building exists. And let me answer the question that's already forming in your mind right now. Did I mess up by saying it out loud? No. If anything, staying silent would have been the mistake. Because silence is agreement with limitation, and you were never built to agree with ceilings. You spoke because something inside you shifted before anything outside you did. Your nervous system clocked alignment before your bank account did. Your spirit checked the time even though the walls still said midnight. And you trusted that internal signal more than the external noise. That's power. They don't understand that chosen people leak truth early, not because they're showing off, but because they're synced up. You weren't guessing, you were remembering. You weren't hoping, you were recognizing. And when that recognition came out of your mouth, it shook people who only move when life pushes them. You moved because you were pulled. Let's talk about the enemy for a second. And when I say enemy, I don't mean some dramatic villain. I mean doubt disguised as concern. I mean laughter disguised as jokes. I mean people who smiled in your face while secretly bookmarking your failure. They heard you say it and thought, who do you think you are? What they didn't realize is that chosen people don't become, they reveal. You didn't elevate yourself. You reported what was already decided. That's why they're quiet now. See, there's a specific kind of silence that shows up when destiny starts hitting its marks. It's not peace, it's shock. It's the sound of people replaying conversations in their head and realizing you weren't talking crazy. You were talking early, and now every step you take feels like an echo of something you already said. Every door opening feels familiar. Every win feels pre-announced, because it was. And let me say this plainly, because someone needs to hear it without fluff. Being chosen doesn't mean being liked. It means being targeted, misunderstood, and doubted until the results make arguments unnecessary. You weren't meant to blend in. You were meant to stand out so clearly that denial becomes exhausting. That's why your rise feels personal to them. It challenges their excuses. It exposes their comfort. It proves that fear was never a rule, just a habit. You didn't speak too soon. You spoke on time for who you were becoming. And now that it's unfolding, don't shrink. Don't soften. Don't apologize for being right early. let it motivate you. Let every quiet stare, every forced compliment, every awkward "I always believed in you" fuel you, because the same mouth that announced your future is about to announce your arrival. And the ones who doubted, they'll call it luck. You'll call it alignment. God is always with the truth. Let's get into it. Before we move any further, pause right here with us for a moment. If this message is speaking directly to you, if it's confirming something you already felt in your spirit, then support this work in a real way. Like this video so it reaches the ones who need it most. Subscribe to the channel so you stay connected to messages that sharpen, strengthen, and awaken you. And if you truly value this energy, please consider showing your love through super thanks. That support helps the team keep pouring in the time, focus, and effort required to bring you these inspiring, life-changing, high-impact videos consistently. Your support fuels the mission. God bless you. Number 1. The shift started inside you long before anyone else had proof, and that's why they doubted you. They didn't doubt you because you were wrong. They doubted you because you were early, and early truth always sounds threatening. Listen carefully, because this part separates observers from the chosen. Before anything changed on the outside, something had already shifted inside you. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, subtly, in a way that didn't come with instructions or applause. And that's exactly why they doubted you. Because the kind of change that starts internally never looks convincing to people who only believe what they can see. You didn't wake up one day and decide to talk big for no reason. You didn't randomly start saying things that didn't match your circumstances. What happened was more dangerous than that. Your tolerance changed. The things you used to accept started feeling wrong. Conversations that once felt normal started feeling small. Situations you once endured started feeling insulting. And before you even had language for it, your mouth started telling the truth before your life could prove it. That's usually where the doubt comes in. Not because you were lying, but because you were ahead of schedule. People love results. They love proof. They love outcomes they can point to and say, "Now it makes sense." What they don't respect is process. They don't respect internal shifts. They don't respect the moment when someone upgrades mentally before the environment catches up. So when you spoke from that upgraded place, it sounded off to them, out of rhythm, premature. They mistook inner clarity for confusion because they couldn't feel the change you were already living with. And let's answer the question that probably crossed your mind back then. Why did it feel so real to me, but so unbelievable to them? Because you were listening to a different signal. While they were tuned into the present moment, you were picking up on direction. While they were measuring life by today's conditions, you were responding to momentum. You weren't imagining things. You were detecting movement before it became visible. That's how chosen people move. Not because they have special treatment, but because they notice shifts early. They feel discomfort sooner. They sense misalignment faster. And when that happens, silence becomes impossible. You spoke because staying quiet would have meant lying to yourself. And that honesty, spoken before permission, made people nervous. Here's the part they won't admit. Your words forced them to confront the fact that growth doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness. Sometimes it shows up as confidence with no obvious source. Sometimes it shows up as someone declaring direction before the map is finished. And people who are standing still don't like being reminded that motion can start invisibly. So they doubted you. They laughed. They said you were jumping the gun. They labeled you unrealistic. Not because you were wrong, but because your certainty exposed how reactive they were. They wait for life to tell them who they are. You spoke based on who you were becoming. That's why your words came first. Long before the opportunity appeared, your confidence arrived. Long before doors opened, your desires shifted. Long before the evidence showed up, the knowing settled in. And that knowing doesn't come with a manual. It just sits there, undeniable, pushing you to speak, even when it feels risky, especially when it feels risky. Now that things are unfolding, people want to act surprised. But there's nothing shocking about it. Momentum always looks sudden to people who weren't paying attention to the early signs. What was once a whisper inside you is now loud enough for everyone else to hear. And suddenly, the same certainty they dismissed feels obvious. That's the irony of being early. You take the heat up front, but you don't have to explain yourself later. You didn't speak too soon. You spoke when the shift happened. They just didn't recognize it yet. Number 2, you weren't guessing the future. You were speaking from a place they hadn't reached yet. They call it luck now because admitting you knew all along would expose how far behind they were. Let's get this straight, because this is where most people get it wrong about you. When you spoke about what was coming, you weren't throwing darts in the dark. You weren't guessing. You weren't manifesting blindly. You were speaking from a level of awareness they hadn't accessed yet. And that gap, that distance between where you were operating from and where they were stuck, is exactly why they misunderstood you. There is a kind of knowing that doesn't come from spreadsheets, timelines, or reassurance. It doesn't need external validation because it isn't born from logic alone. It comes from pattern recognition at a deeper level, from lived experience, from paying attention when others are numb, from noticing internal shifts before the world gives you permission to explain them. That's where your certainty came from, not hope, not fantasy, familiarity. When you spoke, it wasn't excitement talking, it was recognition, the kind that hits you quietly and doesn't ask for applause. You didn't say those things because you wanted them to be true. You said them because, on some level, they already were. You had already rehearsed that life internally. You had already adjusted your thinking, your standards, your expectations. The outside just hadn't caught up yet. That's why there was no panic in your voice, no hesitation, no over-explaining. People who are guessing talk fast. They defend themselves. They look around for agreement. You didn't do that. You spoke calmly, sometimes casually, because you weren't selling an idea. You were stating a direction, and that scared people who only move once the road is paved. Here's what separates you from them. They wait for clarity to arrive from the outside. You respond to clarity when it forms on the inside. They need proof before they commit. You commit when the internal signal locks in. They need life to change before they change how they speak. You changed how you spoke because life had already changed internally. That's why your confidence didn't match your situation at the time. And that mismatch is what triggered doubt. Not because you were wrong, but because you were ahead. You were speaking from a place they hadn't visited yet, and people tend to dismiss places they've never been. It's easier to call someone unrealistic than to admit you can't see what they see. And let's address the question they asked behind your back. How can you be so sure? Because certainty doesn't always come from evidence. Sometimes it comes from alignment, from everything inside you pointing in the same direction at once. When your instincts, your focus, your discomfort, and your ambition all line up, the result is confidence that doesn't shake, even when circumstances lag behind. You weren't inventing a future, you were recalling one. That's why it felt oddly natural to say those things out loud. Not dramatic, not forced, just true. Like remembering a destination you'd already been warned about internally. And people who live only in the present tense don't understand that language. They hear arrogance. They hear delusion. What they don't hear is memory. Now that things are unfolding, they want to reframe the story. Suddenly it's timing, or luck, or coincidence. Anything that avoids the uncomfortable truth that you didn't stumble into this. You walked toward it long before it was visible. They'd rather believe the universe flipped a coin than accept that you trusted yourself when there was no applause for doing so. But you know better. You didn't wait for permission to acknowledge where you were headed. You didn't delay belief until it became popular. You honored what felt solid inside you, even when it looked premature on the outside. That's the difference between people who follow momentum and people who create it. So, no, the future didn't shock you. It only surprised the ones who weren't paying attention. For you, it feels familiar because you've been living with it internally for a long time. You spoke too soon for their comfort, but right on time for your evolution. And now that reality is catching up, the same words that once made them uncomfortable are becoming impossible to ignore. Number 3. The moment you spoke with certainty, you exposed who never had the courage to do the same. The boldest thing you did wasn't saying it out loud. It was reminding everyone who stayed quiet what courage actually looks like. The moment you spoke with certainty, something invisible cracked in the room. Not because your words were extreme, not because you promised something impossible, but because you said it without asking for permission, and that alone unsettled people who have spent their entire lives negotiating with fear. You didn't raise your voice, yet the atmosphere shifted. You didn't challenge anyone directly, yet everyone felt exposed. That's the power of speaking with clarity when others are still bargaining with doubt. Your certainty didn't offend them by accident. It triggered something they had buried. The moment you said where you were going, they were forced to remember where they stopped going. The dreams they delayed, the risks they postponed, the moments they chose comfort over conviction. Your words didn't attack them, but they held up a mirror, and not everyone is brave enough to look at their own reflection. That's why the reactions came fast and sharp. The jokes, the dismissive smiles, the casual, yeah, sure responses wrapped in laughter. Those weren't responses to your vision. They were defenses against their own regret. Because when someone speaks decisively before results exist, it disrupts the unspoken rule most people live by. Don't declare anything until it's safe. Don't commit until you're guaranteed. Don't stand out unless you're already approved. You broke that rule the moment you opened your mouth, and that's why it felt confrontational to them. Not because you were aggressive, but because you were unapologetic. You didn't wait to be validated by circumstances. You didn't soften your tone to make others comfortable. You spoke as if movement had already begun, because for you, it had. And that kind of confidence exposes hesitation instantly. It makes excuses sound hollow. It turns one day into an uncomfortable question mark. Here's the truth most people won't say out loud. They weren't laughing at your dream. They were laughing to avoid admitting they no longer trust themselves enough to have one. Somewhere along the way, they learned to play it safe, to lower expectations, to keep ambitions quiet so disappointment wouldn't feel so loud. So when you spoke freely, without flinching, it reminded them of a courage they used to have and lost. Deep down, many of them admired it. They imagined what it would feel like to speak with that level of certainty, to say what they want without rehearsing the fallout, to move without waiting for consensus. But admiration mixed with fear often turns into criticism. So instead of acknowledging the gap between your boldness and their restraint, they chose the easier route. Label you unrealistic, dramatic, or doing too much. That label wasn't about accuracy. It was about protection. Because admitting your courage would have required them to confront their own inaction. It would have meant questioning the decisions they've been justifying for years. And that's uncomfortable. So they dismissed you instead. They tried to shrink your certainty down to something manageable, something they could laugh off. But confidence that's rooted in direction doesn't disappear just because it's mocked. It matures. And now that your words are starting to align with reality, the discomfort has changed shape. The laughter faded. The comments slowed down. The same confidence that irritated them is now the confidence they quietly study. Not because they suddenly understand it, but because they can no longer deny it. Your certainty didn't collapse under pressure. It held. and that's what makes doubt look embarrassing in hindsight. Your courage aged well. Their skepticism didn't. What this proves is something chosen people learn early. Speaking with conviction will always threaten those who rely on hesitation to feel safe. Your growth didn't create enemies. It revealed them. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the subtle way people show you who they are when you refuse to shrink. And now that your life is moving in the direction you declared, the silence around you speaks louder than the criticism ever did. No explanations, no apologies. No need to say, "I told you so," because reality is doing the talking for you. You didn't just speak too soon. You spoke honestly, before others found the courage to do the same. Number 4. Without trying, you revealed how limited their idea of possible really was. You didn't break the rules. You exposed how small their game was. People don't get angry when you're wrong. They get uncomfortable when you show them how little they ever believed was possible. When you spoke before anything had visibly changed, you didn't just share an idea, you disrupted their mental ceiling. Most of them weren't listening to understand you. They were listening to protect their version of reality. So they didn't hear ambition. They heard a threat, something unfamiliar, something that didn't fit inside the narrow boundaries they had quietly accepted as how life works. You have to understand this. People don't judge new ideas against what could be real. They judge them against what feels safe, against what they've already seen, against what they've already failed at. So when you spoke about outcomes they couldn't imagine for themselves, your words sounded unrealistic, not because they were false, but because they were unfamiliar. You weren't outside reality. You were outside their reality. And here's the part that matters most. You didn't even try to challenge them. You didn't come in loud. You didn't argue. You didn't demand agreement. You simply spoke from your perspective, and that alone exposed how restricted theirs was. That's what shook them. Not your tone, not your confidence, your range. Most people live inside mental boxes they didn't build themselves. They inherited them. From family, from environment, from repetition. They're taught early what's reasonable, what's too much, what's for people like us, and what's not. Over time, those limits start feeling like facts. So when you talked about more growth, more movement, more possibility, it collided with beliefs they had never questioned. That's why they labeled you instead of listening to you. Overconfident, unrealistic, doing too much. Those labels weren't assessments of you. They were defense mechanisms, because admitting that your vision was possible would have forced them to confront why they never aimed higher themselves. Think about it. You didn't tell them they were wrong. You didn't say they were limited. You didn't call out their fear. Yet your words still made them uncomfortable. That's because nothing exposes limitation faster than someone who isn't operating under it. You became a mirror they didn't ask for. And the truth is, most people don't think in terms of expansion. They think in terms of maintenance. Pay the bills, stay comfortable, avoid embarrassment, repeat. Their goals are designed to preserve stability, not stretch imagination. So when you spoke about outcomes that required growth, timing, patience, and belief, they couldn't process it. Not because it was impossible, but because it wasn't familiar. That's why they reacted emotionally instead of logically. Discomfort doesn't announce itself as fear. It disguises itself as judgment. And your vision forced them to feel something they weren't ready to examine. Here's the part they'll never say out loud. Your confidence didn't intimidate them because it was loud. It unsettled them because it was calm. You weren't proving anything. You weren't begging for validation. You were simply certain. And certainty without evidence is terrifying to people who need permission before they move. You had the courage to mentally step into a future that didn't yet exist. They were still measuring life using yesterday's numbers. So when your words didn't match their math, they assumed you were the problem. But now now that things are unfolding exactly the way you said they would, the real issue is impossible to ignore. Their doubt was never rooted in facts. It was rooted in imagination, or rather, the lack of it. They might explain your progress away with timing, or coincidence, or being in the right place at the right time. But deep down, they know the truth. You didn't outwork them first. You outsaw them. You stood in a mental position they never allowed themselves to reach. That's why your early words matter so much now. They weren't just statements, they were exposure. A spotlight revealing who was willing to believe beyond the visible and who was trapped negotiating with their comfort zone. You didn't reveal your limits, you revealed theirs. And the most powerful part, you did it without trying. Number 5. They questioned your words because your real progress was happening out of sight. When you said what you said back then, they reacted to what they could see, not to what was actually happening, and what they could see was outdated. They were looking at an old snapshot while you were already moving in real time. That's why they questioned your words. Not because your direction was wrong, but because your real progress was taking place where their eyes couldn't reach. Most of your work happened when no one was watching. In quiet hours, in moments that didn't look impressive, in decisions that didn't come with announcements. You were refining your thinking, sharpening your focus, and building emotional endurance while the world assumed nothing had changed. They didn't hear the internal conversations you had to win. They didn't feel the pressure you carried in silence. They didn't see the discipline it took to keep going when there was no external reward yet. So when you spoke with certainty, it confused them. To their perspective, nothing justified that confidence. What they were really reacting to wasn't your words, it was their limited access. They only knew the version of you that existed in shared spaces, old habits, familiar patterns. They didn't have clearance to see the private upgrades. And instead of questioning their own perspective, they questioned you. That's always how it goes. People assume the surface tells the whole story, because it's easier than admitting they don't know everything. Internal change doesn't make noise. It doesn't ask for approval. It doesn't come with visible proof at first. It shows up as sharper instincts, stronger boundaries, and a growing sense of direction that feels undeniable to the person experiencing it and completely unconvincing to everyone else. That's why your statements sounded premature to them. They didn't realize the internal foundation was already being laid brick by brick in moments they never witnessed. And here's the part most people miss. When inner work is real, it starts influencing your language before it influences your environment. Your words shifted because your standards shifted. Your tone changed because your tolerance dropped. You weren't talking to impress anyone. You were verbalizing a direction you were already walking toward internally. To someone standing still, that sounds like imagination. To someone evolving, it's just honesty. They judged you through memory instead of momentum. They measured you against who you were instead of who you were becoming. And because they couldn't see the process, they assumed there was none. That's why doubt came so easily to them. It wasn't personal, it was convenient. Doubt requires less effort than curiosity. Now fast forward. Results start appearing. Patterns change. Opportunities line up. Your behavior looks different. Your confidence no longer sounds theoretical, it sounds accurate. And suddenly, the same people are confused. They're trying to mentally trace the path from the version of you they remember to the version standing in front of them now. The gap doesn't make sense to them because they never saw the middle. What they're witnessing now isn't sudden success, it's delayed visibility. Your growth didn't start when they noticed it. It started long before, in silence. The only difference is that now the internal work has reached a point where it can no longer stay hidden. The results are speaking the language they understand. This is usually the moment when disbelief turns into revisionist history, people start saying things like, "You changed fast," or "This came out of nowhere." But you know the truth. Nothing about this was sudden. It was steady. It was intentional. It was built during periods when being underestimated was the norm. People consistently misjudge what they can't see. They mistake quiet focus for inactivity. They confuse patience with hesitation. They label preparation as delay. And because of that, they're always late to recognize momentum. You weren't early. You were consistent. They were just unaware. Your words didn't come before the work. The work just happened out of sight. And now that outcomes are visible, those same words no longer sound bold. They sound accurate. What once felt like overconfidence now reads like foresight. You didn't speak too soon. You spoke while the work was still private. Reality didn't argue with you. It took notes. And now that everything is aligning exactly as you said it would, the invisible effort you invested has turned into undeniable proof. They doubted what they couldn't observe. But nothing built quietly and deliberately ever stops just because it wasn't seen. Number 6. What they called confidence was actually you breaking away from an outdated version of yourself. What they labeled as confidence was never about ego. It was the sound of you shedding a skin that no longer fit. When you spoke the way you did, it wasn't performance and it wasn't for attention. It was resistance. Resistance against staying trapped in a version of yourself that had already expired. You had outgrown the silence, and pretending otherwise would have been the real lie. The moment you opened your mouth, you weren't trying to impress anyone. You were making it clear, to yourself first, that you were done living below what you'd already become internally. There's a phase people don't talk about enough, the one where staying quiet starts to feel heavier than being misunderstood. That's where you were. You had changed, but the world around you was still interacting with an older version of you, one that tolerated less, asked for less, and expected less. And at some point, you realize that if you don't speak, you're agreeing to stay frozen in someone else's outdated perception. So you spoke. Not because you had proof, but because you had clarity. And clarity doesn't wait for permission. Your words carried weight because they were backed by internal movement. Something had already shifted in how you saw yourself, what you allowed, and what you were no longer willing to negotiate. You weren't imagining growth. You were living it privately. And when growth happens quietly, it always shocks people when it finally speaks. That's why they misread you. They thought you were jumping ahead, when in reality, you were catching up to who you already were on the inside. The ones around you couldn't track that evolution. They remembered old patterns, old limitations, old versions of you that fit neatly into their expectations. So when you spoke from a place they hadn't seen yet, they assumed you were pretending. But here's the truth they missed. Transformation doesn't ask for witnesses. It happens in isolation, in discomfort, in moments nobody claps for. By the time words come out, the work has already started. That's why your declarations felt necessary to you, even if they sounded premature to others. You weren't announcing a fantasy. You were closing the door on an identity that had overstayed its welcome. Speaking was the line in the sand. It was you deciding that you would no longer downplay your direction just to keep the peace, and that decision alone is enough to threaten people who rely on predictability to feel safe. Let's address the doubt that probably crept in after you spoke. The "did I say too much?" The "maybe I should have waited." That second guessing doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you stepped into unfamiliar territory. Growth always feels risky because it forces you to be seen before you're fully understood. But chosen people don't wait until the transition is comfortable. They speak when the old version is already gone, even if the new one hasn't been fully recognized yet. What looked like arrogance from the outside was actually resolve. You weren't elevating yourself above others. You were refusing to stay beneath your own potential. There's a difference. One comes from insecurity, the other comes from self-recognition. And self-recognition is disruptive because it removes the need for approval. The moment you stopped waiting to be validated, your words changed tone. They carried certainty, and certainty, especially when it's early, makes people uneasy. Now that reality is starting to align with what you said, the narrative has shifted. The same statements that once felt too much are suddenly being treated like foresight. But don't get it twisted. You didn't magically become right overnight. You were aligned before it was visible. What's happening now is just the external world catching up to a decision you made internally a long time ago. You weren't speaking to brag. You were speaking to break free. Free from shrinking, free from blending in, free from being edited by other people's comfort. That moment you spoke was the first public sign that you had already moved on mentally. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. The old version can't reclaim you. The silence can't contain you. So if anyone still wants to call it confidence, let them. You know the truth. It was courage. It was timing. It was you stepping forward when staying still was no longer an option. And now that it's unfolding, it's clear. You didn't talk too soon. You spoke exactly when the old version of you lost its power. Number 7. Speaking early tested whether you'd still believe in yourself when no one else did. When you spoke before there was evidence, you weren't just making noise, you were stepping into pressure. That moment, whether you realized it or not, was designed to see what you'd do when belief had no witnesses. Anyone can believe when results are visible. Anyone can sound confident when applause is guaranteed. But you spoke when silence followed, when faces twisted, when the room didn't echo back what you said. That wasn't bad timing. That was a test of whether your confidence could survive isolation. The real challenge wasn't what you said out loud. It was what happened after. The pause, the waiting, the lack of reinforcement. When nothing immediately changed, when no proof arrived to defend your words, you were left alone with them. And that's where most people fold. They start editing their past statements, softening their certainty, laughing things off to save face. But you didn't do that. You stood in it. You let the awkwardness sit. You let doubt hang in the air without rushing to clean it up. That's rare. What people around you didn't understand is that speaking early puts you under a microscope. Every delay becomes a question mark. Every quiet moment feels like a judgment. And every day without visible progress tries to convince you that maybe you said too much, too fast. That's the moment where belief either collapses or hardens. And yours didn't collapse. It sharpened. You were being measured, not by others, but by the situation itself. Could you keep trusting your own direction when there was nothing external to lean on? Could you keep moving when encouragement dried up? Could you look foolish for a while without retreating into silence? That's the kind of pressure that exposes whether belief is real or just performative. And you passed it by, not flinching. The reactions around you weren't random. The smirks, the comments disguised as jokes, the sudden distance from people who used to be close, they were all part of the environment designed to see if you'd retreat. Because the easiest way to control someone is to make them doubt themselves. And when that didn't work on you, it unsettled people. You didn't bend. You didn't walk it back. You didn't dilute what you said to make anyone else comfortable. That consistency, even when it cost you socially, was the proof. There's a specific strength required to stay aligned with your own words when nothing seems to support them. It means trusting your internal signal over external feedback. It means choosing self-respect over approval. And it means accepting that being early often feels the same as being wrong until it doesn't. You didn't need reassurance. You didn't need constant confirmation. You let time do what time always does, reveal who was bluffing and who was built for patience. What's powerful about this phase is that no one applauds it. There's no spotlight for staying steady when nothing's happening. No recognition for refusing to backpedal. No praise for holding your ground quietly. But that's exactly why it matters, because the foundation of what's happening now was poured when no one was watching. The strength you built during that stretch is the reason things don't shake you the way they shake others now. And here's the part that stings for the doubters. They thought the waiting would break you. They assumed the lack of results would humble you into silence. They expected you to eventually say, "Maybe I was wrong." But instead, you stayed the same person, same direction, same certainty, same refusal to shrink. And now that things are unfolding, they're forced to realize they were watching a process they didn't understand. Your confidence wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It didn't beg for validation. It existed quietly, consistently, without needing an audience. And that's why it held. What's happening now didn't start when results showed up. It started when you chose not to abandon yourself during the quiet stretch. When you decided that your belief didn't need permission, timing approval, or group consensus to remain intact. You didn't speak too early, you spoke at the moment that required courage. The delay wasn't punishment, it was the filter. It separated those who talk from those who stand by what they say. And now, as reality catches up, it's clear that the real win wasn't just the outcome. It was the fact that you stayed solid long before anyone else believed you should. Before we move on, pause for a second and really think about this. There was a moment when you said something out loud and immediately felt the weight of silence, doubt, or side eyes in the room. You knew what you meant, even if no one else did. That moment matters. That moment says more about you than any result ever could. If this is hitting close to home, don't brush it off. Write it down. Share what you said before anyone believed you. Say it in the comments, even if it still feels early. Sometimes owning your words again is the reminder you need that you were never wrong. Just ahead. Number 8. Their disbelief wasn't logic. It was fear reacting to a shift they couldn't control. What looked like disbelief on the surface was never about reasoning or common sense. It was fear flinching in real time. When you spoke with certainty before the proof showed up, people didn't pause to evaluate facts or odds. They reacted emotionally, instinctively, defensively, because the moment you opened your mouth, something shifted that they could feel but couldn't explain. And when people feel a shift they don't control, their first response is almost always rejection. From their perspective, your words sounded reckless, too confident, too sure for someone who hadn't earned the right yet. But that interpretation was never about accuracy. It was about disruption. You disturbed an invisible balance they were comfortable living inside. A balance where outcomes felt predictable, where people stayed in their lanes, where nobody spoke futures into existence before permission was granted. Your certainty broke that unspoken agreement. The truth is, your confidence didn't intimidate them because it was loud. It unsettled them because it was calm. You weren't asking, you weren't convincing, you weren't pitching an idea. You were stating direction, and direction is dangerous to people who survive by reacting instead of deciding. The moment you claimed a future they couldn't see yet, you took control of a narrative they assumed was fixed. That's where the fear came from. They weren't measuring whether you could actually pull it off. They were reacting to the realization that someone had stepped outside the rules they live by. You didn't wait for circumstances to approve your mindset. You didn't wait for validation to shape your identity. And that independence hit a nerve because it exposed how much of their life is negotiated with fear. People like to believe they doubt because they're realistic, but realism is often just fear dressed up as intelligence. When someone insists that something is too soon, too risky, or impossible, what they're really saying is, "I wouldn't dare move like that." Your willingness to speak early forced them to confront how cautious they've become, how much they rely on guarantees before they move, how tightly they cling to control. And here's the part that matters for you to understand. Their reaction was never a verdict on your potential. It was a reflection of their limitations. Your words created movement before results did, and movement is threatening to people who depend on stillness to feel safe. You activated momentum in a room full of people who were standing still and calling it stability. Of course they pushed back. Of course they tried to downplay what you said. Of course they framed your certainty as arrogance. Fear always looks for a way to regain control. What they didn't expect is that the direction you spoke into didn't collapse. It didn't fade. It didn't embarrass you. It started unfolding, slowly at first. Quietly, in ways they couldn't track or interfere with. And that's when the discomfort deepened. Because once reality begins to move in the direction you named, disbelief loses its power. There's nothing more unsettling than watching something you dismissed begin to organize itself without your permission. Now they're stuck. They can't mock it anymore because it's visible. They can't dismiss it because it's consistent. They can't control it because it's already in motion. And that loss of control is what they were afraid of from the beginning. Your progress isn't just success. It's proof that their fear-based logic was never as solid as they thought. Every step you take forward forces them to confront a truth they avoided. That hesitation feels safe until someone proves it unnecessary. That waiting for certainty is not wisdom, it's a choice, and you chose differently. So if you ever wondered why the resistance felt so emotional, so personal, so charged, now you know. You didn't just speak early, you disrupted the illusion that outcomes are only allowed to change slowly, predictably, and with everyone's approval. You showed that direction can be claimed before consensus forms, and that's why this matters for you now. Because the same fear that reacted to your words is now watching your life confirm them. The same people who questioned your timing are quietly adjusting their memory of events. The same disbelief that tried to shrink you is being forced to coexist with results it can't explain away. Your declarations were never reckless. They were precise. They weren't premature. They were aligned with movement that had already started beneath the surface. The shift didn't begin when things became visible. It began the moment you stopped waiting to be told who you were allowed to become. They didn't doubt you because you were wrong. They doubted you because your certainty reminded them how much control they've surrendered in their own lives. And now that it's all coming true, there's nothing left for them to do but watch. Number 9. Your progress didn't just prove you right. It exposed how badly they misjudged you. Some people don't miss the truth because it's hidden. They miss it because they already decided who you were. Here's the part that hits the hardest, and it's the part they never prepared for. Your progress didn't simply confirm that you knew what you were talking about. It did something far more uncomfortable. It exposed how shallow their judgment was from the very beginning. When you spoke before the evidence showed up, they weren't just skeptical of your words, they were dismissive of you as a person, your capacity, your depth, your ability to become more than the version they had grown used to seeing. They locked you into a mental snapshot and treated it like a permanent record. People do that. They mistake familiarity for accuracy. They see one chapter of someone's life and assume the ending is already written. So when you opened your mouth with confidence before the results arrived, they didn't think, maybe they're growing. They thought, who do they think they are now? Not realizing that growth doesn't send announcements. It happens quietly, behind closed doors, in routines no one applauds, and in sacrifices no one tracks. While they were busy forming opinions, you were forming habits. They never saw the hours you invested when no one was watching. They didn't feel the mental pressure you carried while staying disciplined in silence. They didn't experience the moments where quitting would have been easier, more socially acceptable, and far less lonely. All of that work stayed hidden, which made it easy for them to assume nothing was happening. And because nothing was visible yet, they concluded nothing was changing. That's where they went wrong. You didn't speak early to impress anyone. You spoke because you could feel momentum building before it had a shape, because something inside you had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Confidence showed up not as noise, but as direction. And to people who only respect outcomes, direction without proof looks like exaggeration. They judged you using outdated data. Most people do. They project the present forward and call it realism. If someone looks stuck today, they assume tomorrow will look the same. If someone hasn't arrived yet, they assume they never will. And if someone speaks with certainty before validation, they label it overconfidence instead of foresight. It's easier that way. It protects them from having to admit they missed the signs. Because here's the truth they're now forced to sit with. The version of you they doubted doesn't exist anymore, and the version standing in front of them now wasn't built overnight. It was assembled slowly, intentionally, and out of sight. While they were comfortable underestimating you, you were quietly closing the gap between intention and execution. That's why this moment feels so loud. As your words start turning into results, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The difference between who they assumed you'd remain and who you've actually become is stark. It doesn't just prove you were onto something, it highlights how confidently wrong they were. The whispers fade. The side comments stop landing. The skepticism loses its footing when reality steps in and backs you up. What once felt like premature confidence now reads like preparation. And there's a particular kind of discomfort that comes with realizing you misjudged someone who never stopped moving. Because it means their opinions weren't cautious or thoughtful. They were lazy, built on surface-level observation instead of curiosity, built on comfort instead of awareness. Your progress forces a reckoning, not an argument, not a debate. A silent one, the kind where people revisit old conversations in their head and realize they dismissed something real, the kind where they have to sit with the fact that what they labeled ordinary was actually focused, what they called slow was actually deliberate, and what they brushed off as insignificant was quietly powerful. That's the part that makes your rise hit harder than a loud victory ever could. You didn't need to announce every step. You didn't need their approval. You kept moving while they kept assuming, and now, standing where you are, the truth is unavoidable. Underestimation isn't insight. It's a limitation of perspective. You didn't just grow, you revealed the gap between perception and reality. So when they watch you now, understand this. They aren't just seeing your success, they're seeing the cost of having misread you. And that realization carries more weight than any apology they'll never give. And this is where it all comes together. If you ever questioned yourself for speaking too early, let this be your confirmation. You weren't ahead of your time, you were in sync with it. Your growth didn't happen by accident, and your voice wasn't premature, it was precise. If this message felt like it was talking directly to you, don't keep that to yourself. Share what you once said before anyone believed you. Drop it in the comments. Your story might be the proof someone else needs to keep going. If this resonated, make sure you subscribe, support the video, and pass it on to someone who needs this reminder right now. May God bless you, guide you, and continue to elevate everything you set in motion.